guys, we're gonna keep going with the miraculous journey of Edward Tulane. Gosh, we just met Bryce and Sarah Ruth, and now Edward is Jangles. He belongs to Sarah Ruth, who we have learned clearly have some kind of a cough. There's something wrong with her. Hold on a minute, we're not sure. So, sorry about that, guys. So let's continue reading. We're going to do chapter 18. And from the looks of it, on chapter 18, we have what looks like a little box with lots of buttons in it. Who knows what that might be, huh? Bryce and Sarah Ruth had a father. Early the next morning, when the light was gray and uncertain, Sarah Ruth was sitting up in bed, coughing, and then Father came home. He picked Edward up by one of his ears and said, "I ain't never." "It's a baby doll," said Bryce. "Don't look like no baby doll to me." Edward, hanging by one ear, was frightened. This, he was certain, was the man who crushed the heads of china dolls. "Jangles," Sarah Ruth said between coughs. She held out her arms. "He's hers," said Bryce. "He belongs to her." The father dropped Edward on the bed, and Bryce picked up the rabbit and handed him to Sarah Ruth. "It don't matter anyway," said the father. "It don't make no difference, none of it." "It does matter," said Bryce. "Don't you sass me," said the father. He raised his hand and slapped Bryce across his mouth, and then he turned and left the house. "You ain't got to worry about him," said Bryce to Edward. "He ain't nothing but a bully. And besides, he don't hardly ever come home." Fortunately, the father did not come back that day. Bryce went out to work, and Sarah Ruth spent the day in bed holding Edward in her lap and playing with a box full of buttons. "Pretty," she said to Edward as she lined up the buttons on the bed and arranged them into different patterns. Sometimes, when a coughing fit was particularly bad, she squeezed Edward so tight that he was afraid he would crack in two. Also, in between coughing fits, she took to sucking on one or the other of Edward's ears. Normally, Edward would have found this intrusive, clingy behavior very annoying. But there was something about Sarah Ruth. He wanted to take care of her. He wanted to protect her. He wanted to do more for her. At the end of the day, Bryce returned with a biscuit for Sarah Ruth and a ball of twine for Edward. Sarah Ruth held the biscuit in both hands and took small, tentative bites. "You eat that all up, honey. Let me hold Jangles," said Bryce. "Him and me got a surprise for you." Bryce took Edward off in a corner of the room, and with his pocket knife, he cut off lengths of twine and tied them to Edward's arms and his feet, and then tied the twine to sticks of wood. "See, all day I've been thinking about it," Bryce said. "What we're going to do is make you dance. Sarah Ruth loves dancing. Mama used to hold on to her and dance her around the room." "You eating that biscuit?" Bryce called out to Sarah Ruth. "Uh-huh," said Sarah Ruth. "You hold on, honey. We got a surprise for you." Bryce stood up. "Close your eyes," he told her. He took Edward over to the bed and said, "Okay, you can open them up now." Sarah Ruth opened her eyes. "Dance, Jangles," said Bryce. And then, moving the strings with the sticks with one hand, Bryce made Edward dance and drop and sway, and the whole while at the same time with his other hand, he held onto the harmonica and played a bright and lively tune. Sarah Ruth laughed. She laughed until she started to cough, and then Bryce laid Edward down and took Sarah Ruth in his lap and rocked her and rubbed her back. "You want some fresh air?" he asked her. Let's get you out of this nasty old air, huh? Bryce carried his sister outside. He left Edward lying on the bed, and the rabbit, staring up at the smoke-stained ceiling, thought again about having wings. If he had had them, he thought, he would fly high above the world to where the air was clear and sweet, and he would take Sarah Ruth with him. He would carry her in his arms. Surely, so high above the world, she would be able to breathe without coughing. After a minute, Bryce came back inside, still carrying Sarah Ruth. She wants you too, he said. Jangles, said Sarah Ruth. She held out her arms. So Bryce held Sarah Ruth, and Sarah Ruth held Edward, and the three of them stood outside. Bryce said, "You gotta look for fallen stars. Them are the ones with magic." They were quiet for a long time, all three of them looking up at the sky. Sarah Ruth stopped coughing. Edward thought that maybe she had fallen asleep. "There," she said, and she pointed to a star streaking through the night sky. "Make a wish, honey," Bryce said, his voice high and tight. "That's your star. You make a wish for anything you want." And even though it was Sarah Ruth's star, Edward wished on it too. Okay, so we've learned a little bit more about Bryce and Sarah Ruth. We've learned that the he that was referred to in the last chapter was definitely a father. It seems like he's a rather abusive father. Doesn't seem to do too much for these two children, so that's very, very sad in itself. Thank goodness they have Edward, his AKA Jangles. Be sure to check out your Google Classroom for your assignment, and I'll see you next time. Thanks, guys. Bye.